Perfect, thank you. Avalon Center is located in Chibuktuk, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Acknowledging our presence on this land is particularly important when holding conversations about sexualized and gender-based violence, which have historically been and are currently still today, tools of violence and colonization against Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. We invite you to reflect on the land on which you currently reside and join us in standing in solidarity and action with residential school survivors, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and their families, land and water protectors, and Indigenous people and communities across the country. We are all treaty people and have an active role to play in reconciliation. We also acknowledge the connection between the land and African Nova Scotians and stand with survivors of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children and all forms of institutional abuse and neglect. We recognize the environmental racism present in Nova Scotia and are committed to addressing legacies of racism and white supremacy in our work to end gender-based violence. April 2021 is the 20th anniversary of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, a time to honor the voices and experiences of victims and survivors and to bring awareness to issues relating to sexualized and gender-based violence. Everyone has a role to play in ending sexual assault, harassment, and abuse, and we thank you for being here today to learn with us. Avalon Sexual Assault Center works to eliminate sexualized violence and the social and political culture that fosters violence and oppression through a continuum of community-based prevention and response services. The Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities is a catalyst in building social, community, and political leadership of persons with disabilities in Nova Scotia, and envisions a future where the abilities of persons with disabilities are fully recognized and developed, and living as equals in society. We're so thrilled to be here with Suzanne and Sherry, who will speak to the ways that people with disabilities are subject to gender-based violence, a community that is particularly vulnerable, but often not centered in this important conversation. Before we get started, I want to direct you to the question and answer button, which is located in the middle of the taskbar on the bottom of your Zoom window. There will be a time for question and answers, so please ask away either using this feature or the chat, which I will be monitoring throughout the webinar. There is also live closed captioning available, which you can turn on by pressing the live CC caption button on the bottom taskbar of your Zoom window. When the webinar is complete, a survey will pop up that we hope you can take a moment to fill out. This will help us evaluate the series and plan for future events. Thank you in advance for taking the time to do this. I also want to acknowledge that discussions about sexualized and gender-based violence can be challenging, especially for survivors in the virtual room. In the chat box, I will be posting a link to a resource with several grounding activities that may help if you feel overwhelmed. Please take care of yourself in this space and afterwards. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Suzanne, who is a journalist in the HRM, and Sherry, who's the coordinator of the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities, who will both share about the experiences of survivors of gender-based violence with disabilities and the Not Without Us project. Thank you.
Great. Well, can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Me too.
This is the Not Without Us project. I would just want to thank Dee for inviting us to take part today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us to hear about the work that we've done. We started in 2019, as well as Joanne Bernard with Easter Seals, Nova Scotia. So
Hi, Suzanne. Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if you can hear me, but you're frozen right now.
Sherry, can you give us the back?
Yes, I'm more than happy to.
Oh, okay.
So yes, I will provide a bit of background on the work that we're currently doing. And I'll start with a bit of history on persons with disabilities here in.
And
Hello? Suzanne, are you trying to connect?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can hear you now.
Okay, I stopped sharing my screen. So I was just going to, I did an introduction of myself, and I thought maybe you could talk about the background of the project.
Absolutely. So I'll just jump right in here. So on December 3rd, 2018, I believe it was, December 3rd is the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. And the League at that time brought together a group of women with disabilities for discussion on key issues that are faced by women and girls with disabilities in the province. Because at that time, the United Nations had chosen the theme of empowering persons with disabilities and ensuring inclusiveness and equality, which was very ironic to those who were sitting around the table, because this was the furthest from everyone's mind, because women and girls were often challenged when it comes to being empowered and feeling more isolated than included and equal, particularly women with disabilities. And pardon me, this project was actually started because of a report that was released by Dawn Canada, More Than a Footnote. And that national research identified that there is limited empirical data available to draw an accurate picture for women and girls with disabilities across Canada. And furthermore, although Stats Canada reported that 1 in 5 in Canada live with a disability, there was not any data that was available based on self-identification, and it still represented a huge gap. So the conversations that we were having on December 3rd, one of the things, we decided that there were a number of different goals and intent that we wanted. And the meeting was to have a conversation and explore the opportunity to bring together women and girls to share experiences, address the gaps, and also to identify solutions. So it wasn't about a group of women coming together saying, oh, woe is me. That was not the intent. It was to say, here are some of the challenges, but here are also some of the solutions. And some background work on previous work that was done. So we were able to provide an outline that would allow us some outcomes that we were hoping to achieve going forward. The short-term outcomes were we wanted to have personal insight necessary to heal and to achieve greater independence and to increase in a feeling of well-being, self-confidence, and self-esteem. We're also looking for an increase in knowledge and of community supports that were available, because depending on where we lived, you could either have access to supports or there were not. But again, this was all in conversation, no empirical data. We were also looking for opportunities for peer support and for networking and knowledge of needs of the greater independence, as well as networking and disability organizations, accommodations, education that could be available that we weren't aware of. And last but certainly not least, we were looking for a decrease in feelings of isolation and better access to sexual health care. In the long term, we were looking for full and equal participation for women and girls with disabilities in their communities based on informed choices. With personal experiences were shared at the roundtable discussion. And one of the things that was identified was the opportunity to work with the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the status of women, and that perhaps we could potentially apply for some funding to do a project that would help to identify empirically the data that we were talking about around the table, but again, did not really have any solid background on. And that's where Suzanne steps in as the project coordinator for the Not Without Us. So Suzanne, I'm hoping that your connection has improved and that you're able to expand a little bit.
Yes. Thank you, Sherry. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I did have a PowerPoint I was going to share, but I think I'm going to avoid that because it might be sucking up too much with my internet connection here. But I'll talk a bit about the projects. So Sherry and Joanne hired me in May of 2019. And the goal at that point was to host 5 sessions across the province in Yarmouth, Sydney, Halifax, Amherst, and the Annapolis Valley, to gather the stories of women with disabilities experiencing domestic violence, as well as the stories from the staff at organizations that work with those women. So we organized all of those at accessible spaces, usually campuses at
Hi, Suzanne. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me, but you're frozen.
the NSCC. And we advertised those sessions. Guys, for this, okay. So we hosted. Can anyone hear me?
We can now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am so sorry. So when I was organizing a session in Cape Breton, I invited some people from Port Hawkesbury who pointed out, well, you might as well be on the moon, because for a lot of women in that community, they don't have access to transit. So transportation was one of the first issues that came up in these meetings. So then we went. And we ended up having total included survivors as well as staff from different organizations across.
Hi again, Suzanne. Sorry to interrupt. You're frozen. I'm wondering if
and we heard public.
Suzanne, I don't know if you can hear me, but you're frozen. I'm wondering if we,
Oh, goodness.
If Sherry, you would mind talking about some of the findings?
I don't mind talking about some of the findings at all. I know that we had anticipated that we were going to be doing 5 sessions around the province, going from Yarmouth to Cape Breton, because we wanted to ensure that all voices were heard, understanding as well that there are extreme circumstances where, when we're talking about women with disabilities, oftentimes what happens is that the person who is doing the abuse is actually their caregiver and the person's primary support. So it makes it very challenging for them to be able to come to a discussion and talk openly. In addition, when we're talking about rural parts of the province, there is more sharing of information, so you're more likely to know what your neighbors are doing. So the confidentiality piece was a huge, I'm going to say a huge flag that we wanted to ensure was going to protect individuals who came forward. And again, as I think we heard, that one of the key issues was that transportation piece. Also, when we were looking at going into, if you did call out for support, who do you call? And one of the challenges was that oftentimes a woman or a girl who was being abused or victimized, there really wasn't a place to call, because if you are a woman with a disability and you know that within that shelter there is not going to be room for your support or your attendance, you're not going to call in the first place. So there are so many that were not able or that could not come to the table. But out of what we did learn from those who were able to step forward, there was a demand to have these conversations. So while we started with 5 that we wanted to do around the province, it almost tripled from the responses in the community for organizations and individuals who wanted to be included in the conversation. And it was part not only with visits into a community, but there was also the opportunity to be able to call, to be able to have one-on-one meetings, to be able to protect the individuals and have their stories told. So out of those findings, as we identified, transportation was huge, accommodations is huge, affordable and accessible places for someone to live. And part of the biggest piece was in identifying, and this is not a slight on the shelters who are providing programs and services. That is not the intent. But what was identified, that there were a large number, 90%, if not a larger percentage, of transition homes and shelters that were not able to provide supports for women and or girls with disabilities because of accessibility. And that is a huge concern, because shelters are doing the best that you can to meet the needs. So if you don't know what those needs are, you can't meet them. But on the other hand as well, part of what we are trying to do is not to, we're trying to have conversations where we have identified the gaps, but we're also working on how we can solve those issues. So when we're talking about, as an example, if somebody needs support services, what kind of support services are needed? Do those supports from a woman in a rural part of the province, are they going to follow that person into a transition home? If they can, what is the level of support that is required? So what's happening is the conversations are changing, and the supports that are identified are being recognized as needing to be able to follow the individual, not for the transition or the shelters to have to provide them, but for the individual to have those for her to be able to take them with her. And I'm going to stop just for a second there to see if maybe, because this is a lot of information, I just want to see if there's anyone around the table who may have a question or might want to jump in with something that they've heard so far, because I know I can talk quite fast, and I've been a part of this for such a long time that I might race over things that you may want to explore a little more. So I'm going to stop for a moment to allow for a question or questions that I might be able to field so far.
Thank you, Sherry. That was all really helpful background and some of the findings of the Not Without Us project. I wanted to just let all of the attendees know that although the internet is a bit shaky, Suzanne is available to answer questions via the chat as well. And like Sherry mentioned, now is an open space if there are any thoughts or comments or questions so far. Again, you can use either the question and answer feature or pop a question or comment into the chat.
Yeah. So I'd also like to, still connected, I'd like to highlight some of what we heard around the community, because I know we touched on transportation, so the transit is, women's centers, we've touched on communication. Policing can be a huge issue as well. On the course of the meeting, several of the trends that we did notice were around the home care, needs of women with intellectual disabilities as well that were not being met. The policing and the lack of knowledge and training around accessibility issues is huge. That in and of itself could be a conversation. But then we also looked at second stage housing, internet and communications. In many places around the province, internet may not even be available. And then that socio-economic piece, can somebody actually afford the internet? Or even having phones that are readily available to them. There are a number of the League's consumers, as an example, who are nonverbal. And the option to call a place such as 911, because that training is not there, when they call 911, they are hung up on because they don't think anybody is there. So there's training that needs to happen at so many different levels. But I think one of the most important things that has come out of our project is these conversations, because awareness leads to actions. We don't know what we don't know. We can't fix what we don't know is broken. So out of the conversations came some key recommendations around accessibility audits, around education and training, around navigation and outreach, the potential for community leadership around home care, education on domestic violence and accessibility, because as I mentioned earlier, is that oftentimes the person who is doing the abuse is the person who is taking care of the person who is being abused. And trying to navigate around that can be a huge challenge when you're in isolation. And that's what's happening for many women and girls with disabilities. So out of this, and I know that we can't go into a lot of detail on what's happening because these details are still being worked out as a follow-up to the key recommendations, but all of these key recommendations have been accepted in their entirety by the provincial government. And those are the things that we are working on. So as I mentioned, the cultural considerations for African Nova Scotians, First Nations, Aboriginals, the issues around home care, the community leadership, navigation and the outreach, education and training, the accessibility audits. And those accessibility audits are something that are what we would say are the low-hanging fruit, if I could use that term, because you can have an accessibility audit which would then be able to identify in the community what those gaps are, so individual organizations and shelters can know, oh, so we can access funding to ensure that this can be made accessible, or this is a gap, so this needs to be fixed. So that education and training is huge. I will stop there because I know I've done a lot of talking.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I see there's a question about the extent of people who were institutionalized. That was one of the challenges of this project, is a lot of women who are disabled, especially in rural Nova Scotia, are isolated and they could not come out to meet with me for a couple of hours and share their stories. So we need to find ways to get to them. And I think that's where the training piece comes in that Sherry was talking about.
Thank you. There's some really great ideas on how to better engage with communities with disabilities that are experiencing violence that I think are so important for us to pick up on. Sherry, I really take to your point around awareness. I think that that's so important. And when we're speaking about people who have disabilities and their experiences of gender-based violence, although they are one of the most overrepresented statistically in terms of victimization, we don't often center communities with disabilities as part of the conversation. So I think that that's something that we absolutely need to change, and raising that awareness is so important. And I'm also really interested in your ideas about training and how we can better incorporate this information when we're working on training initiatives with communities. So thank you so much for sharing that. If you wouldn't mind, I have a question. And as I ask that, I will again invite people to share their questions or comments in the chat box or question and answer feature. But my question is for both Sherry and Suzanne. And it's, what do you think that the survivors that you work with would want service providers to know about their experiences? So what do we need to continue to learn about people with disabilities and how they experience gender-based and sexualized violence?
Can anyone hear me, or should I write it in the chat box?
We can hear you.
Okay. I think a lot of the women talked about the understanding that abuse is not abuse, financial abuse, but also the understanding that a lot of disability is hidden disability. So, and I know Sherry talks about this all the time. And so that's important, the understanding of the diversity of disability and what these women need to navigate systems.
Thank you. That's a really excellent point. I think that, culturally, when we think of disability, there's a very narrow definition of what that is. And such a large population and portion of our community experience disability that might look very different from that. And because of that, I think are falling through the cracks of services. And so steps towards accessibility of our organizations and our systems really need to think more broadly about that and how we're responding. So I think that's a really excellent point. Thank you. I'm also wondering what service providers can do on an individual level to better support survivors with disabilities.
I think one of the most important things that can be recognized is, whether we realize it or not, and even as someone who's been in the disability community my entire life, we can certainly, without thinking, become ableistic in our language and our perspectives of persons with disabilities, because it's not about the disability, it's not about the support that we can offer, it's the support that the first voice is asking for. So it's always about putting the person first and the disability second, in the rear view mirror, and addressing the needs of the individual.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that that's a really important sentiment to remember. There is a question from one of the attendees, so I'm going to just, hopefully this works, turn on the microphone for Teresa.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Teresa. Sorry, I think you're still muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yeah.
Yay. Okay, thanks. So I have DID, and I was born in cycle, and I didn't know I was born in the cycle. I knew it was wrong, but I kept repeating my cycle, not realizing, and just thought it was bad luck. So I'm 40 now and have been drugged through the system and community, really, for now very prevalent symptoms that I didn't notice I had before. I find now that I'm focusing on what's wrong with me, I feel like everyone can see what's wrong with me, whereas for 38 years, I walked through this planet with confidence in myself and my abilities. So that is a big issue. I think that also punishing women that have already been punished is what causes these disorder symptoms to come out later in life. Because now you've just been let down by the system that was supposed to protect you. But I think that women sit in these relationships as well because we do love and we don't know that we're disabled, because I don't fucking like that word. Sorry for my language. Sorry.
No need to apologize.
I am fully abled, which is why I actually wanted to come onto this webinar, because I really loved your slogan or what have you. I think in my work, I'm in Ontario, by the way. So hi, Scotia, that's where I'm from. So I'm trying to create a program here that will empower women without, I don't know how to word this. I didn't know there was anything wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with me. I have normal reactions to normal things that have happened. But there's got to be a language that can inform people. I was taking people that were addicts and homeless when I was on trial in a town I didn't know anyone, because I fled there from my ex who had broken into my house. So in saying that, I was also made to plead guilty because I had PTSD and didn't make for a good witness. So if that doesn't tell you that our system is definitely broken, it's definitely broken, but I'm sure you guys already know this with all these stats. But I'm just confused as I didn't know that this happened to women. I didn't know that this was the way. So I don't know what I'm trying to say. Because I have CPTSD. And I know I'm branching off right now. Sorry, guys.
No need to apologize. Like, I want to
see the flow of where I'm going with that. I don't want to just be your client. I don't want a babysitter. I don't want a peer support worker. I want someone that's going to help elevate me, not hold my hand while I'm still broken, right? Do you know what I'm saying? And that's really what I'm seeing from the outside of all of these places, instead of empowering them by employment or teaching them. Like, it's just too much peer support information to give to women that are going to be in denial that they're broken because they are sitting right across from somebody that they know is broken. So I guess I shouldn't say broken, sorry. Does anyone understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank God. It takes me
Yes.
5,000 words to describe one, sorry.
I know exactly what you're saying, Teresa. I know that women with disabilities experience, there's a higher range and a wider range of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse that's involved. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, it's by your intimate partner that will do it. And the end result often is that you're afraid to report it because you may not be believed, or that you're perceived as not credible because of circumstances, or that there will even be appropriate services available.
I think
And
retaliation's big.
yeah, exactly. So the law enforcement, when an incident is reported, oftentimes persons with disabilities are more likely than not to say they were dissatisfied with the response by the police, because law enforcement authorities may not take the appropriate action to respond to the reports. And again, not having the proper training to be able to deal with women and girls with disabilities. So you end up not reporting it. And then you live with the circumstances or retribution from your spouse or your intimate partner because of an escalating situation, because the resources were not there for you and you felt. The important thing is that you felt the resources were not there for you.
So
because regardless, yeah.
Sorry. So we're wired different, and I've done a lot of trauma research in the past 2 years because they just feed meds. And I'm like, I've never been on a med in my life. This is insane. And you're making it worse, honestly. So I just think that I don't know how to say this. So sorry. There's got to be a strengthening thing. Like, so my comprehension of things, and I will say this for my whole stat, because it sounds like we sound like we're speaking English. We think we're speaking English, but what we say and what we interpret are two totally different things. So I think that the language of communication with people of my stat is what can empower them with their capabilities of what they're going through, and they have strength to be able to overcome it. That it's not okay, because when we walk around a society that, that your abuser's walking in, or even, sorry guys. So, okay, sorry. I just lost my thought. Damn it. Sorry.
No problem. I think you're raising a lot of really important points, and I want to thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that experience. I think that there's a lot to learn as service providers from what you're saying, particularly around our assumptions of what community needs. I think that there's a lot to be said to your points around offering supports that are more holistic than maybe they are currently. So
Definitely holistic. I do art therapy, so
yeah, that's such an important tool for healing. And I think that we often don't rely on those creative outlets as part of service provision, but I do think that that is something that's so helpful to survivors. So again, I want to thank you. And if you want to share more, I'll invite you to
unmute. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, how do I unmute? Sorry.
Oh, I do that from my end, so don't worry.
Thanks. Bye, Nova Scotia. Thank you so much.
Bye, Teresa.
Thank you. There is a question, Sherry and Suzanne, in the chat that asks, to what extent is the lack of resources across the board for health and social services contributing to a lack of accessible options as opposed to a lack of awareness? Even when people are educated, their ability to act on that knowledge and improve conditions may be extremely limited. Compassion, respect, and being non-judgmental is fundamental, but only goes so far when those who have the power do not make decisions in the best interests of the community.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? It's Suzanne.
Yes.
I think that's important because especially in the smaller communities, a lot of the shelters, there was a lot of knowledge around disabilities and accessibilities that I found from the staff, but they just don't have the resources, and their shelters are just not equipped. And some of them are in very old, century-old homes in some cases, which there is only so much you can do. And that's certainly not the fault of the staff again, or the leadership at all. So that is an issue. And they might have a ramp on the building, but they might not have enough money to put some of the communication pieces into place, for example. So it's certainly not a lack of awareness or education on the part of staff. It's just lack of funding, really.
Yeah. Which really speaks to the structural issues that I think are also highlighted in that question around, how we make change when those with power are not necessarily amendable to that change, and when their decisions are not in the best interest of the community, which was the comment that came from the question, and don't involve the community in that decision-making process.
Yes, I know there was one question I asked, especially of the staff. I said, if money was not an issue, and we always know that it is, what would you do to improve accessibility? And they already knew how they would make their shelters more accessible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that also raises something that Teresa was talking about earlier around people with disabilities and people who experience any type of marginalization are not tokens, like they are not broken. They're people, and we need to do a better job to include them in the creation and implementation of services, because the answers lie in those communities.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
If I could just also offer here, what we're talking about is embedding a thought process into everything that we do.
Yes.
So when we talk about including them or us, we're already unconsciously having a separation, when in reality, we're all one community, regardless, and we're all connected. And it's unfortunate it's not unfortunate, it's very sad and heartbreaking when you hear from the Teresas of the world who are saying, I feel so disconnected, but we're a community. And we have to learn to embed that inclusion into everything that we do, into how we speak, into how we have a conversation even. And I know that's challenging, but we have to learn how to do that.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. There's another question in the chat box that asks, what is a good invitational question that we can use on intake forms or conversations? Not forms, it doesn't say that. It says, what can we use in our intake conversation to help understand hidden disabilities?
And there's one that we have always used. It's, do you require any disability related accommodations? It's a simple question and nobody's offended by it. You don't know what you don't know. I've had people come back to me and say, well, you didn't provide this. And my response is, you didn't let me know.
Yeah, that's great. That's, a really accessible, easy question. Thank you. Another question asks, what would be the key points of possible advocacy for decision makers to hear?
First, voice.
Yes.
I have to come back to that all the time. And that's, there is a level of fear and uncertainty, I think, on both sides when we are looking at how do we accommodate. And it's not brain surgery, and it's not that somebody is being, called onto the mat. It's just recognizing that there are differences between all of us, and there are very simple ways that we can accommodate. And a large part of that is the conversation of first voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's crucial in engagement with all communities. Those who have the lived experience are absolutely necessary to be part of the process, any type of process. So I think that that's a really important point for us to all take with us and try and incorporate personally in our individual work as well as organizationally. How can our organizations do better to include that first voice? Okay, are there any last comments or reflections?
It's Suzanne again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was going to say, I think one thing I learned is that any one of us can become disabled at any point.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. There's a comment.
So if we get a diagnosis, we haven't.
Yeah.
Some of these women that I met became disabled because of the abuse too.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. The effects of violence and abuse are far ranging. They impact us physically, emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally, spiritually, interpersonally. Abuse and violence essentially impacts every aspect of our being. And there's definitely always the potential for disability to happen as a direct result of violence.
Yes. And I think one of the things when we're talking about key things to remember is that we all, regardless of our ability, want to feel valued. We want to feel that we are safe, and we want to feel that we are respected. And put whatever you think is an ability or a disability aside to save space and to allow the individuals to be independent, don't do for people. That's an ableist kind of view. Give me the tools that I can do it for myself.
Yes.
Give me the resources, give me the means that I can do it for myself. Don't do it for me. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking to have the tools to be able to live independently without having to ask for help, without having to have somebody do it for me, because that's what demeans me. That's what undervalues me, is when you do it for me.
Yeah. Thank you, Sherry. I think that's a beautiful sentiment to wrap up on, and something for us to take away and think about how we can contribute to that, that feeling of empowering and working with, rather than doing for, when we're working with survivors with disabilities and all survivors. So I want to thank you both so much, Sherry and Suzanne, for taking the time to share with us this afternoon. For all of the attendees, I will let you know that Suzanne has shared the slides with me. So with the follow-up email that is sent to you automatically through Zoom, which you should get tomorrow, there will be a copy of both the Not Without Us report as well as the slides from today. And with that, I want to wish everyone a wonderful weekend. And again, thank you for taking the time to learn with us this afternoon and stand with survivors of gender-based violence, particularly those with disabilities.
Thank you, Dee.
Thanks. I hope you all have a great afternoon and weekend. It's Friday.
Thank you.